consisting of his mother, Beverly Dollarhide, and his two older siblings, Gary and Jason Barclay. His father was largely absent from his life, leaving Beverly to raise the children alone. Beverly worked as a cashier and was known to struggle with drug addiction and financial instability, which placed strain on the family. With limited support and resources, the household became chaotic and unpredictable, a fact that would significantly influence Nicholas's behavior and mental state. Beverly's addiction and the pressures of being a single mother likely contributed to her struggles with parenting. As a result, discipline was often lacking in the household, and Nicholas, the youngest child, began acting out at an early age. His relationship with his mother was strained, and the household environment was far from stable. Though there is limited documentation on the dynamics between Nicholas and his older siblings, Gary, the eldest sibling, had moved out of the house and started her own family. Jason, the middle child, who was significantly older than Nicholas, also had his issues with substance abuse, particularly heroin, and also lived with the family intermittently. This added another layer of instability to Nicholas's home life. From a young age, Nicholas displayed signs of oppositional and defiant behavior, which began to manifest more prominently as he entered adolescence. He was known to be a difficult child, often acting out in school and at home. His behavioral issues were severe enough that they caught the attention of teachers and other authority figures. He frequently got into trouble, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and aggressive as he grew older. Nicholas's rebellious attitude often put him at odds with his mother and older brother, both of whom struggled with their own issues. Beverly found it difficult to manage Nicholas's defiance and frequent outbursts. His disciplinary issues escalated to the point where he had multiple run-ins with law enforcement. At the age of 13, he had several interactions with the police for petty crimes, including stealing and being disruptive in public. His behavior also led to numerous suspensions from school, and his academic performance began to decline. Nicholas was frequently in trouble for skipping classes, getting into fights, and showing disrespect towards teachers and authority figures. As Nicholas entered his teenage years, his relationship with his mother became even more volatile. Beverly found it increasingly difficult to manage her son's behavior and often resorted to calling the police in an attempt to discipline him. This only further fueled the tension between them. Nicholas began to stay out late, defy curfews, and engage in delinquent activities such as stealing and vandalizing property. The relationship between Nicholas and his older brother was also problematic. Jason, who had his own history of criminal activity and drug abuse, was not a positive influence in Nicholas's life. By the age of 13, Nicholas had developed a significant record of juvenile delinquency. His repeated interactions with law enforcement became a source of concern for his family, teachers, and social workers. his behavior became more frequent in the months leading up to his disappearance. His legal troubles culminated in a court hearing that was scheduled for June 14th, 1994, regarding his past offenses. There was a strong possibility that Nicholas would be sent to a juvenile detention center as a result of his ongoing defiance. This impending court date loomed over Nicholas and his family. The prospect of being placed in a detention center likely exacerbated Nicholas's feelings of anger, frustration, and fear. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Nicholas continued to display this behavior, which consisted of staying out late, ignoring his curfews, and engaging in petty crimes. Despite these issues, there was little intervention from social services or law enforcement, as his behavior had become almost routine. This combination of his unstable home life, emotional struggles, and legal troubles created a volatile situation that would ultimately culminate in his disappearance on June 13th, 1994. Earlier that day, Nicholas had gone out to play basketball with friends at a local park in San Antonio, Texas. He had no school obligations since he had been repeatedly suspended for misbehavior, and like most days, he spent his free time outside. The court was close to his home, and it was a place where he would often go to hang out with older boys and friends in the neighborhood. His mother was accustomed to Nicholas coming and going, sometimes returning home late or running away for short periods. Around midday, after Nicholas had spent several hours at the basketball court, he called home and spoke to his mother. Beverly wasn't available at the time, so Nicholas spoke with his older brother Jason, who was staying at the family home intermittently. Nicholas asked Jason if he could walk home from the park instead of getting a ride. Jason, however, told him that their mother was sleeping and wouldn't be able to pick him up anyway. This conversation seemed innocuous at the time, and Nicholas's request to come home on his own wasn't unusual. The distance between the park and Nicholas's home was relatively short, about a mile, and Nicholas had walked this route many times. San Antonio was a familiar territory, and the neighborhood where the basketball court was located wasn't considered particularly dangerous, even for a young teenage boy. His family had no reason to suspect that anything out of the ordinary would happen during his short walk home that evening. According to later reports, Nicholas was last seen around 5 or 6 p.m. on June 13th, 1994, leaving the basketball court where he had spent most of the day. Witnesses reported seeing him walk away from the court, apparently heading home. He was wearing a white t-shirt, purple pants, and black sneakers, clothing that made him stand out but was not out of the ordinary for Nicholas, who often dressed in a casual and relaxed style. At some point after leaving the court, Nicholas simply disappeared. There were no clear sightings of him along the route to his house, and no witnesses who reported seeing anything unusual or suspicious. It was as if Nicholas had vanished into thin air on what would have been a routine walk home. When Nicholas failed to return home that evening, his family did not immediately panic. Nicholas had a history of disappearing for a few days at a time, only to come back home after cooling off. This pattern of behavior was consistent with his rebellious attitude. Beverly, who had dealt with Nicholas's erratic behavior for years, wasn't concerned at first. She figured he would return within a day or two, as he had done on previous occasions. However, as hours and hours passed where Nicholas failed to show up, concern started to grow. By the next morning, when Nicholas still hadn't come home or contacted anyone, his family began to worry that something might have actually been wrong. They reached out to friends and neighbors, asking if anyone had seen or heard from Nicholas, but no one had any information about his whereabouts. On June 14th, 1994, the day after Nicholas's disappearance, Beverly contacted the police to report her son missing. However, given Nicholas's history of running away, the police did not treat the case as an urgent matter. They categorized him as a runaway and did not immediately launch an investigation. The family's explanation of Nicholas's frequent runaway episodes, combined with his pending court hearing scheduled for the next day, led the police to believe that Nicholas had run away to avoid facing consequences for his past legal actions. The court hearing, scheduled for June 14th, was significant, as it was possible that Nicholas would be sent to a juvenile detention center. This looming threat of being detained provided a plausible explanation for why Nicholas might have decided to run away again, this time for a longer period. As the days passed and Nicholas still didn't return, tensions within the family grew. Jason, Nicholas's older brother, began to express guilt and frustration over the fact that he hadn't gone to pick up Nicholas from the basketball court. Some family members later recalled that Jason seemed agitated in the days following the disappearance. However, Jason's troubled past and issues with drug addiction made his behavior erratic, and he wasn't always coherent or reliable when discussing the events of that night. Despite their initial belief that Nicholas had run away, Beverly and other family members began to organize their own search efforts in the weeks following his disappearance. Flyers with his picture were distributed in the local area, and the family reached out to neighbors and friends, hoping for any information that could ultimately lead to him. Unfortunately, their efforts yielded few results, as there were no credible sightings or tips. The police, still treating the case as a runaway situation, did not devote significant resources to the investigation. This lack of urgency created tension between the family and law enforcement, and Beverly became increasingly frustrated with what she perceived as a dismissive attitude towards her son's disappearance. As the weeks turned into months and years, the lack of progress in finding Nicholas left the family in a state of limbo, unsure of what happened to their family member. In October of 1997, Spanish authorities received a call from a man who claimed to be a missing teenager. The individual had been discovered by police in Linares, a small town in Spain. He had initially told them that he had escaped from a child trafficking ring, providing a harrowing story of abuse and neglect. When asked for his identity, the young man claimed that he was Nicholas Barclay, the boy who had disappeared from San Antonio, Texas, in 1994. This claim seemed too good to be true, but Spanish authorities contacted the U.S. Embassy, which in turn reached out to the Barclay family. The family was astounded by the news that Nicholas had been found alive and seemingly safe after more than 3 years. They had assumed the worst, that Nicholas was dead or had disappeared for good. His mother and older sister, Carrie, were particularly overjoyed at the thought of his return, and both were eager to see the boy they believed was Nicholas. Sorry for the pause. There's a name that I really don't know how to pronounce. I'm going to attempt, but I'm probably going to butcher it. Frederic Bourdin. The man claiming to be Nicholas had a history of deception and impersonation. A French national born in 1974, Bourdin had spent most of his young adult life impersonating various teenagers across Europe. He often posed as a runaway or orphaned youth, manipulating authorities and foster systems to provide him with shelter and care. His skill at mimicking different accents and adopting fabricated backstories made him successful in deceiving people. Upon learning about Nicholas's disappearance, Bourdin saw an opportunity. He knew that the missing teenager's physical appearance and age were close enough to his own that he could believably pass as Nicholas. In particular, he knew that Nicholas had distinctive tattoos that Bourdin could replicate. Despite being 23 years old at the time, Bourdin calculated that his small frame, youthful features, and manipulative abilities would allow him to convincingly pose as a 16-year-old. When Beverly and Carrie were informed that Nicholas had been found in Spain, they were initially overjoyed. At first, when Carrie saw Bourdin, she had some doubts. The individual claiming to be Nicholas looked different than she remembered. His hair was now darker, his face seemed more mature, and, most disturbingly, he had a slight French accent. These inconsistencies were difficult to overlook, but Bourdin quickly provided explanations for his appearance and mannerisms. He claimed that his kidnappers had dyed his hair, and that the trauma he had endured over the years was responsible for his altered speech patterns. Despite these oddities, though, Carrie chose to accept him as her brother. After all, he had the same tattoos as Nicholas, and shared many details about their family that only Nicholas would know. Bourdin's ability to gather and manipulate personal information about the family made his story seem plausible. Carrie convinced herself that the trauma Nicholas had endured could account for the changes in his appearance and behavior. Once Carrie accepted Bourdin as Nicholas, the rest of the family followed suit. Beverly also accepted the imposter into her home when he returned to Texas. For a family that had experienced years of anguish and uncertainty, the return of Nicholas, regardless of the oddities, seemed like a miracle. In their desire for closure and relief, they overlooked the discrepancies in his story. Once Bourdin returned to Texas as Nicholas, he settled into the Barclay family's life with Most assumed that these changes were a result of the trauma that he had suffered. His foreign accent, which Bourdain explained away as a result of being held in Europe for years, raised some eyebrows. Still, no one seemed willing enough to question the identity of the young man too closely. During this period, Bourdain remained careful to maintain his facade. He kept his conversations with the family and authorities vague when it came to specifics about his captivity, relying on emotional manipulation to deflect any probing questions. Bourdain also avoided any interactions with law enforcement or institutions that could potentially uncover his true identity. Despite these efforts, cracks in his story began to appear. Some family members, particularly Jason, expressed doubts about the legitimacy of Bourdain's identity. Jason had been skeptical from the beginning, noting that Nicholas didn't look or act like his younger brother used to. However, Jason's credibility was compromised due to his issues with drug addiction and erratic behaviors. This led to his concerns being largely dismissed by the rest of the family. As Bourdain settled into life as Nicholas, his case attracted the attention of a private investigator named Charlie Parker. Parker had been following the story of Nicholas Barclay's return and had become increasingly suspicious about the inconsistencies surrounding Nicholas's identity. His doubts were shared by an FBI agent named Nancy Fisher, who had been assigned to the case due to the international nature of the events. Fisher, too, found it difficult to reconcile the appearance and behavior of the person claiming to be Nicholas with the boy's original identity. Parker and Fisher independently pursued their investigations into the situation. Parker, in particular, was struck by the stark physical differences between Nicholas and the other Nicholas who had returned. He noted that Nicholas had light blonde hair and blue eyes, whereas the individual claiming to be him had dark brown hair and brown eyes. These discrepancies were too significant to be explained away by Bourdain's claims. In an attempt to verify Bourdain's identity, Parker decided to confront him directly. During a visit to the Barclay home, Parker took photographs of Bourdain and compared them to pictures of Nicholas. The differences were apparent, and Parker became convinced that the person living with the Barclays was not Nicholas. Parker then presented his findings to the FBI, who began to conduct a more thorough investigation. Eventually, the FBI obtained a court order to conduct a DNA test on Bourdain to confirm or deny his identity. In March 1998, DNA tests conclusively revealed that the person claiming to be Nicholas Barclay was not, in fact, Nicholas Barclay. This shocking revelation confirmed the suspicions of both Parker and the FBI. The DNA evidence proved beyond a doubt that Bourdain was an imposter, and the man who had been living with the Barclay family for several months was a liar. Following the DNA results, Bourdain's true identity as Frederick Bourdain times. He was born in 1974 in Nanterre, France. His upbringing was difficult, marked by the absence of his father and a strained relationship with his mother. Bourdain spent most of his childhood in foster care and felt deeply alienated from his family and society. These early experiences of neglect and abandonment fueled his desire to reinvent himself, which ultimately led him down the path of serial impersonation. In the case of Nicholas Barclay, Bourdain was motivated by the desire to be a part of a family, even if that meant deceiving the Barclays into believing he was their lost son. The trauma and grief that the Barclay family had experienced made them particularly vulnerable to Bourdain's manipulation. Frederick Bourdain's impersonation of Nicholas Barclay became a sensational story, covered extensively in the media, and later adapted into a 2012 documentary titled The Imposter. The case remains one of the most notorious examples of identity fraud and serves as a cautionary tale about the power of deception and the vulnerabilities of those who have experienced profound loss. Bourdain's manipulation of the Barclay family was a cruel exploitation of their grief, and while he has since been released from prison, the emotional scars left on the family will likely never heal. Now, I do want to highlight the fact that Nicholas, the real Nicholas, has never been found. His family still doesn't know what happened to him on that June 13th, on that day when he went home after basketball. We don't know what happened to him, which is sort of the worst part of the story. And the second worst part of this story is the fact that this guy only got 6 years in prison. I think he should have gotten a lot more than that for doing such a heinous crime. I don't think this is just a case of identity fraud. I think this is a lot bigger and a lot worse. But please let me know what you guys think.